He had spent a lifetime serving others, washing the feet of the forgotten, feeding the poor, and carrying burdens that most men would collapse under. To the world, he was Pope Francis, the spiritual father to millions. But in the quiet shadows of the Vatican, he was simply a man who loved deeply. And one of his greatest loves walked on four legs. When the end drew near, no grand farewell was arranged. There were no public addresses, no declarations of legacy. Instead, in the privacy of his chamber, as the light faded and breaths became slower, he made one final request. Not for the church, not for his name, not even for his soul. His voice was fragile, almost breaking. Please take care of Leo. Don't let him feel alone. Leo wasn't a cardinal. He wasn't a theologian or a world leader. He was just a dog the world didn't know about, a companion that never stepped into public view, but one who remained faithfully at his side when cameras were gone, when pain crept in, and when silence became his truest prayer. This video isn't just about a pope's hidden companion. It's about what this moment reveals, about love, about God, and about the sacredness of all creation. Why would the vicar of Christ, in his final moments, think not of himself, but of a creature most people overlook? Because in that moment, Pope Francis wasn't teaching doctrine. He was living it. He was showing us, perhaps one last time, what it means to carry divine compassion, not just for the saints, not just for the sinners, but for every living soul that walks this earth, for feather or flesh. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will not only change the way you see this man, it might just change the way you understand love itself. Leo wasn't chosen. He wasn't bred, purchased, or gifted. He came into Pope Francis' life in a way most sacred things do, quietly, unexpectedly, and with divine timing. The story goes back to a rainy evening in Rome, years before illness ever darkened the horizon. Pope Francis had just returned from a visit to a small hospice. He was tired, his cassock soaked to the hem, his soul heavy from the stories he just heard of loneliness, regret, and forgotten lives. And as he stepped through a side gate of the Vatican garden, he noticed something small, shivering near the wall. A stray dog, thin, soaked to the bone, and looking up at him not with fear, but with a gentle kind of knowing. Most people would have called for a guard. Others might have simply walked past. But Francis knelt down, extended his hand, and whispered a single word. Tiens Hambra. Are you hungry? The dog didn't bark. He simply moved closer and rested his head on the Pope's palm. From that night forward, the dog became part of his private life, unofficial, unspoken, yet fully embraced. He named him Leo, not after a pope, but after a lion. Not because of his strength, but because of his quiet courage, the kind of bravery that suffers in silence, that waits with hope, that trusts without needing proof. Leo never left his side. In the mornings, he would wait by the door as Francis prayed. In the evenings, he would curl at his feet while he wrote homilies. When the Pope walked alone in the garden, Leo followed, not as a pet, but as a shadow of loyalty. No photographers ever caught him. No articles ever mentioned him. But those inside the Vatican knew Leo was more than a dog. He was part of Francis' spirit. It was said that Leo could sense the Pope's moods. When his knees ached, Leo would press against his leg. When the Pope sat in contemplation, Leo would lie still, breathing in rhythm. And when Francis cried, and yes, even popes cry, Leo would simply stay close, his silence more comforting than any prayer. They had a bond that needed no words. A connection that echoed something ancient, something Edenic, when man and creature walked in harmony, without fear, without dominance, without shame. People close to Francis often said he saw animals not just as creations, but as messengers. Not to be worshipped, not to be idolized, but to be understood as reflections of divine tenderness. In Leo, he saw the face of mercy. In Leo, he saw the humility of life that does not ask for more than presence, warmth, and love. In Leo, he saw God's simplicity, the way grace can arrive in fur and eyes and breath, without theology or hierarchy. He once whispered to a confidant, "Leo doesn't judge me. He just sits with me." And sometimes, that's the holiest thing of all. And maybe that's true. Maybe in Leo, Pope Francis found a love untouched by expectation, a love that asked for nothing but gave everything. And maybe that's why, when his body began to fail and the weight of years pressed harder on his soul, Francis wasn't thinking of titles, legacies, or headlines. He was thinking of the creature that had been there through it all. A dog named Leo, who never spoke, but taught him more about God than most men ever will. To some, it might seem strange. A pope, a man entrusted with centuries of sacred tradition, forming a deep, almost sacred bond with a dog. But to those who truly understand the heart of Pope Francis, it makes perfect sense. This is the same man who chose the name Francis not for grandeur, but for Saint Francis of Assisi, the gentle soul who preached to birds, embraced lepers, and saw every creature as a brother or sister. In the eyes of Pope Francis, Leo wasn't just a dog. He was part of God's creation, living expression of humility, loyalty, and silent grace. To love a dog that deeply was not a distraction from his calling. It was, in many ways, a fulfillment of it. Because love, the real kind, doesn't compartmentalize. It doesn't say, I only have compassion for people, but not for animals. No. True compassion expands. It overflows. It sees the sacred in all things. Francis once said in a private conversation, "We have failed when we see the world as a tool for man, instead of seeing man as a steward of the world." That is the foundation of his love for Leo. It wasn't emotional indulgence. It was theology in action. It was a lived expression of his belief that every living being carries a spark of the Creator's breath. Think about it. A dog does not pretend. A dog does not flatter. A dog does not manipulate or judge. He simply is present, devoted, honest. And in a world of masks, politics, and hidden agendas, even in a church, Leo offered Francis a space of pure authenticity. That's why the Pope would sometimes sit in silence for hours with Leo beside him. Not to escape his responsibilities, but to remember what matters most. Presence, stillness, loyalty, grace. In the Gospels, Jesus speaks of the lilies of the field, of sparrows, of sheep. He uses animals to teach divine truths, not because they're simple, but because they're true. Pope Francis understood that. He often said that the Church must return to the basics, to the things that smell like heaven: mercy, simplicity, tenderness. And Leo, in his quiet companionship, embodied all of that. He didn't care for titles or vestments. He only knew the sound of his master's voice, and that was enough. Some would mock that affection. They'd say it's sentimental, unimportant, unworthy of a spiritual leader. But perhaps the real question isn't why a pope would love a dog so deeply. Perhaps the question is, why don't we all? Why have we allowed ourselves to become so hardened that we no longer see the divine in the gentle eyes of a creature that cannot speak, but loves without measure? Why do we overlook the sacredness of a wagging tail, a silent vigil, a presence that stays, even when everyone else leaves? For Pope Francis, Leo was not a break from his mission. He was a mirror, a reminder, a living parable that even popes need to be reminded of the gospel they preach, not through books, but through beings who simply love. And maybe that's why, in those final days, when his body was failing and the weight of leadership grew quiet, he didn't reach for scrolls or speeches. He reached for Leo. Because in that connection, unspoken, untheological, unpolished, there was something real, something holy, something that, perhaps, whispered more of heaven than all the cathedrals combined. Not every holy moment needs to be spoken. Not every miracle is loud. Some of the most sacred encounters happen in complete silence, in stillness so deep it echoes through eternity. That's how it was between Pope Francis and Leo. There were no commands, no tricks, no forced affection. Just two souls sharing space, a man who carried the burdens of the world, and a dog who simply chose to sit beside him, without asking anything in return. Most people imagine the Pope surrounded by constant noise, bells, voices, protocol. And often that was true. But when he could escape to the garden, or retreat to the small stone chapel behind his quarters, he would take Leo with him. And there, in the absence of cameras, microphones, and expectations, they would sit. No words, no movement, just the quiet rhythm of two breathing hearts, one beating under a cassock, the other under fur. And in those silences, something beautiful would unfold. Peace. Not the kind the world gives, brief, conditional, fragile, but the kind that grounds the soul. The kind that says, you are safe. You are known. You are not alone. There were stories whispered among Vatican staff, They'd say that if Francis had a particularly heavy meeting, with grieving families, with troubled bishops, with news from war-torn lands, he would come back, lay his hands on Leo's head, and just breathe. And Leo would just stay, unmoving, present, a sentinel of comfort. It became their ritual. No candles needed, no incense, just presence. And that's what made those moments so powerful. Because in a world obsessed with speaking, convincing, and leading, Pope Francis found refuge in simply being. Leo never asked for his attention. He never interrupted. He never demanded anything but the chance to be near. And in that nearness, Francis found a reminder of how God often speaks. Not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a still, small voice. One of his aides once said, "The Pope prays differently when Leo is with him. He prays slower, deeper, like he's not rushing toward heaven, but walking beside it." That was the magic of Leo. He didn't distract. He grounded. He was a living invitation to slow down, to listen, to let go. There were days when Francis would sit in the garden for hours, his hands resting on his lap, Leo curled at his feet, and not a single word spoken. But in those hours, more healing happened than in all the speeches delivered that week. Because that's what love, true, gentle, spiritual love does. It holds space. It doesn't fix. It doesn't preach. It simply stays. And maybe that's what God wanted to remind the Pope of. That sometimes the holiest communion is not found in consecrated bread or soaring hymns, but the quiet loyalty of a creature who stays even when you have nothing left to give. Those silences between Francis and Leo were sacred because they weren't empty. They were full of presence, memory, hope, and invisible threads of grace. And that's why, toward the end, when Francis grew weaker, he didn't ask for elaborate prayers. He simply asked that Leo be nearby. Because in those silent moments, he wasn't just remembering a dog. He was remembering what it means to be loved without needing to speak at all. At first glance, Leo was just a dog, a silent presence, a soft shadow in the corners of the Vatican, known only to a few. But somewhere along the way, slowly, quietly, he became something more. More than a companion. More than a pet. He became a symbol. Not of status. Not of sentimentality. But of what it means to love and be loved with nothing in between. It didn't happen with a ceremony. There was no moment of sudden realization. It was gradual, like sunrise through fog. And Pope Francis, a man known for discerning the sacred and the simple, began to see Leo not just with affection, but because Leo wasn't asking for anything. He didn't want favor, reward, or attention. He simply existed, faithful, observant, and whole. And in that existence, Francis began to see echoes of the divine. He once confided to his personal assistant, "Leo doesn't try to be good. He just is. He doesn't fear judgment or seek approval." And maybe that's the closest thing to innocence I've seen. That insight marked a shift. Francis no longer saw Leo as something below man. He saw him as a creature fully at peace with himself, and therefore fully at peace with God. What if, he began to wonder, this was what the saints meant by surrender? Not grand gestures, not heroic sacrifices, but a quiet trust, a presence that simply is, and in being, brings peace. As his health declined, Francis grew more contemplative. He spoke less in public and spent more time in private prayer. And Leo was always there, not like a caretaker, not like a nurse, but like a silent witness, a creature who needed no explanation to understand the weight of goodbye. The Vatican staff began to notice. Leo wouldn't leave Francis' side for long. If the Pope moved, he followed. If he sat, he curled beneath the chair. If he wept, Leo pressed close, offering no words, just presence. It became clear Leo had become a vessel of grace, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. He was the embodiment of unconditional love, the kind the world longs for, the kind the church preaches about, the kind that reflects, in its purest form, how God loves us. No conditions, no expectations, no scoreboard, just presence, just loyalty, just being. And maybe, in the mystery of it all, Pope Francis saw something that most people miss. That animals, in their simplicity, are closer to the divine than we realize. They don't carry shame. They don't pretend. They don't manipulate. They live in the moment. They trust. They stay. And in Leo, Francis saw what humanity often forgets, that God isn't only in the grand, but in the quiet. Not only in the cathedrals, but in the pause that follow us in silence. Leo became a teacher, not of doctrine, but of truth. And Francis, a man who had spent his life preaching to millions, found his heart most moved by a soul who never said a word. That's when Leo became more than a pet. He became a bridge between worlds, between human and divine, between silence and meaning, between earthly loyalty and eternal love. It began with a slight weakness in the legs, a tremble when climbing stairs, a breath that came shorter than usual after just a short walk through the garden. At first, Pope Francis dismissed it. He said, fatigue, the weight of long days and long prayers. But deep down, he knew. The body was whispering what the soul had already sensed. The season was changing, and Leo knew it too. He began following closer than before, sleeping lighter, watching every move. He could sense something shifting, not just in the Pope's body, but in the rhythm of their days. There were moments when Francis would pause, resting longer than usual, his fingers trembling over a prayer book. And Leo would lay his head gently on the Pope's foot, as if to say, I'm here. You're not alone. As the illness progressed, the Vatican grew quieter around him. Fewer public appearances, more closed-door meetings. And still, Leo was always there. But what most didn't know was that, during this time, Pope Francis was preparing something deeply personal. Not a final message to the Church. Not an encyclical. Not even instructions for his burial. He was preparing a request. One small, simple, and sacred. It wasn't written in a document or sealed with a signature. It was whispered to a single trusted cardinal in a moment of exhaustion and vulnerability. When I go, please don't leave Leo behind. The words were quiet, but the weight behind them was immense. This wasn't a logistical note. It was an act of love. In that request, Francis was saying more than, take care of my dog. He was saying, don't let him suffer. Don't let him wonder why I'm gone. Don't let him believe I abandoned him. Because for a man who had seen the abandonment of the poor, the forgotten, the elderly, the idea of his most loyal companion feeling that same pain, even for a moment, was unbearable. Leo had never asked for anything, never demanded, never questioned. But Francis, in those final months, couldn't shake the thought, who will sit with him when I'm gone? And so he made his secret request. Not public, not formal, just a whisper of the heart, the kind of final wish that reveals everything about a person's soul. The cardinal who received the message was moved to tears, not because it was grand, but because it was so deeply human. In the shadow of death, Pope Francis wasn't concerned about legacy or power. He was thinking of Leo, the silent companion who had carried no title, no robes, no voice, only love. That request remained private. It wasn't written in Vatican records. It wasn't discussed in strategy meetings. But those close to Francis never forgot it. Because in that moment, that final quiet ask, the Pope once again preached his greatest sermon. Not from a pulpit, but from the soft, trembling lips of a man who had loved well. They were some of his last coherent words, not spoken to a global audience, not broadcasted on Vatican television, but whispered, broken and slow, to a man who had walked with him through the quiet corridors of age and decline. Please, don't leave him alone. No title, no name, just him. And yet, the meaning was unmistakable. He was speaking of Leo, not of church politics, not of unfinished documents, not of theological disputes or the future of the papacy. Just Leo, the dog who had shared his solitude, the creature who had never judged, never questioned, never left. In that single sentence, there was a river of unspoken emotion. Francis didn't ask for comfort for himself. He didn't ask for praise or even prayers. He asked for something infinitely smaller and yet infinitely larger. He asked for love to continue, even when he no longer could give it. Don't leave him alone. That wasn't a logistical instruction. It was a final benediction. A plea born from the deepest chambers of a heart that had loved silently and deeply. And in those 6 words, Pope Francis revealed the core of his soul. It was the same soul that had embraced the poor on the streets of Buenos Aires, that had kissed the feet of prisoners, that had wept for war, for hunger, for the forgotten. But Leo wasn't part of any grand cause. He was just a quiet witness to a life lived under the pressure of the divine and the weight of humanity. The cardinal who received the words held Francis' hand as he said them. He nodded slowly, and in his heart something broke. Because how could such a small, personal request carry so much light? Because love, the true kind, is often revealed in the details. Not in declarations, but in whispers. Not in what we say to the world, but in what we ask when we believe no one's watching. Please don't leave him alone. It wasn't just about Leo. It was about every soul that had ever been abandoned. Every creature left behind. Every life overlooked because it didn't speak or vote or tithe. Francis had spent his life fighting for the dignity of the voiceless. And in his last breath of clarity, he spoke for one more. That request would never make headlines. It wasn't written in papal documents, but it lingered in the room, in the hearts of those present, and in the silence that followed his death. And Leo? They say that when Francis passed, Leo remained by the bed. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just lay there, eyes open, ears forward, as if waiting for one more whisper. The Vatican guards later said he didn't want to leave the room. They had to carry him gently, speaking to him in low tones, as if he too were in mourning. Because he may not have known titles or theology, but he knew presence. He knew love. And he knew more than anyone what it meant to have lost something sacred. And so, in that moment, when Francis left this world and Leo sat alone, the words returned, "Please don't leave him alone." And they didn't. Not because of duty, but because of love. Because a man who had given everything for the world had asked for one small thing in return, and that was enough. The Vatican has always been a place of protocol. Every detail, from how doors are opened to how silence is maintained during a funeral, follows tradition sculpted over centuries. It is a world of structure, dignity, and order. So when the final moments of Pope Francis arrived, the machinery of the church moved quickly and efficiently. But something unexpected lingered in the air. It wasn't the rituals that disrupted the rhythm of the Holy See. It was a sentence. A simple, quiet sentence that refused to be buried. Please don't leave him alone. The request, shared quietly among trusted cardinals, didn't appear in any public record. But within the walls of the Apostolic Palace, it spread like a gentle ripple through a still pond. Some didn't believe it at first. A dog, they murmured behind closed doors. A papal request about a dog. For some, it felt unorthodox, even beneath the dignity of a pontiff. But for others, especially those who had truly known Francis, it made perfect sense. It wasn't about Leo. It was about what Leo represented. Loyalty, innocence, presence. Several members of the papal household remembered Leo well. They'd seen him wait patiently outside prayer chambers. They'd watched him sit quietly near the Pope during moments of deep exhaustion. And they'd heard Francis refer to him not as a pet, but as a gift. One Swiss guard, speaking in hushed tones to a fellow soldier, said, "I think he helped His Holiness carry the weight." Another whispered, "That dog understood something about suffering." He never barked. He just stayed. In the days that followed the Pope's passing, Leo became a quiet presence in the halls of marble and gold. He didn't understand the processions. He didn't bow to tradition. But his eyes searched every corner of the residence, looking for the man whose scent still clung to the floor tiles. The staff made accommodations. A blanket was laid in the same corner where he used to sleep. Meals were brought with reverence. One nun even sat beside him some evenings, reading psalms aloud as if he could understand every word. And maybe he could, or maybe he didn't need to. Because something in the way he stayed, so still, so faithful, began to move even the most stoic hearts. One cardinal, known for his strict posture and reserved demeanor, stopped outside the garden gate one morning and watched Leo resting beneath a tree. He stood there for several minutes in silence, then simply said, "That animal understood something about grace that we still struggle to teach." There's no need for debate, no theological discourse, just the unspoken realization that this final request had revealed something holy, not just about Leo, but about Francis, and about all of us. Because if the Vicar of Christ could make his last desire not about power or preservation, but about love for a creature without voice, then maybe we had all missed something along the way. Maybe the final gift of his pontificate wasn't a document or a statement. Maybe it was a dog, and the quiet message carried through his fur, his footsteps, and his loyal gaze. A reminder that we are not measured by the greatness of our position, but by the gentleness of our heart. And so, within the walls of the Vatican, that ancient seat of power and doctrine, a dog named Leo walked slowly through rooms now filled with silence, carrying not a title, but a legacy of love. It would have been easy to dismiss it. A man nearing death asking someone to care for his dog. It sounds ordinary, tender, perhaps, but not extraordinary. And yet, it was. Because when you look closely, not with the eyes of logic, but with the eyes of the soul, that final wish wasn't just about Leo. It was about the essence of everything Francis believed. Please don't leave him alone. In those 6 words, there was a theology of compassion, a distillation of decades of preaching, writing, and serving, reduced to a simple plea for loyalty, for presence, for mercy. Why would the Pope, who had access to the highest minds in the Church, use his final breath to ask for something so small? Because in that moment, the veil between heaven and earth was thin. The noise of status had fallen away. And what remained was what always remains when death comes. Love? Not theoretical love. Not conditional love. But the kind that sees value in the smallest, softest, most overlooked parts of creation. Francis had always taught that God hides in the humble. Not in thrones, but in stables. Not in power, but in presence. Not in voices that command, but in creatures that simply stay. And Leo stayed. That's why his request was so much more than affection. It was a final act of reverence. A declaration that even at the end, no life is too small to matter. And maybe that's what we keep forgetting. We think faith is about grandeur. We think service must be public, measurable, important. But Pope Francis reminded us with his last wish that holiness often lives in the hidden, in the quiet loyalty of a creature who listens without words, in the soft responsibility of caring for someone who cannot repay you. In Leo, Francis saw more than a dog. He saw a living parable, a sermon on 4 legs. And by making Leo the center of his final desire, he did something radical. He lifted the invisible. He dignified the unnoticed. He showed us that real love is not reserved for the powerful. It is proven in how we treat the powerless. And isn't that the message of Christ? A Savior born in obscurity, a King who washed feet, a teacher who said, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do unto me." Francis lived that message, not with fireworks, but with faithfulness. And in those last days, when the world expected a grand theological statement, he gave them something better. A final act of pure love, a moment that no press release captured, a request that didn't require applause, just a whisper, soft, vulnerable, eternal. Please don't leave him alone. It was a reminder to all of us that love is not measured by how loudly it speaks, but by how softly it notices. That we don't need to change the world in one bold act. Sometimes, we only need to take care of what's right in front of us, even if it has 4 legs, even if it can't thank you, even if no one else sees it, because God does. And maybe, just maybe, when Francis made that final wish, he wasn't only asking for Leo. Maybe he was asking for all of us, that we would not be forgotten, that someone would stay close, that when the time comes, someone would choose love over duty, presence over protocol, and compassion over control. There's something sacred about the way an animal looks at you. No judgment, no agenda, just presence, raw, real, and immediate. Leo looked at Pope Francis like that, and Francis, in turn, began to understand something profound. Leo wasn't just watching him, he was reflecting him. Over time, Francis stopped seeing Leo as other. He began to see Leo as a mirror, not of his position, but of his soul. Because what Leo returned to him day after day was not filtered through power, ritual, or fear. It was pure recognition. The truth is, animals don't flatter. They don't pretend. They don't care about titles or history or control. They only respond to what is true in the moment. And if you stand in front of them, angry, afraid, closed off, they feel it. If you're hurting, they sit closer. If you're joyful, they match your rhythm. If your heart is clear, they trust you completely. That's why Leo stayed. Not because Francis was a pope, but because Francis was honest. In Leo's calm eyes, the Pope saw more than devotion. He saw a silent report card, a reflection of who he had become when no one was watching. When Francis prayed with doubt, Leo rested quietly. When he prayed with peace, Leo slept deeply. When the Pope wept, Leo never turned away. And that's when Francis began to understand what ancient mystics had whispered for centuries. The soul will always recognize what is real, and so will every creature born of love. Animals, in their purity, show us what we've forgotten. They live fully present. They don't store resentment. They don't manipulate, deceive, or seek status. They simply exist, in rhythm with the world, in trust with their instincts, in harmony with silence. In Leo, Francis saw something most people spend their lives avoiding: the truth of the self. No masks, no performances, just soul. And that's why the bond between them deepened. It wasn't sentimental. It was spiritual. Because when you find a being, human or animal, who accepts you entirely, without needing you to be anything more than what you are in that moment, you begin to feel what God must feel for us. And that changes you. Francis began to live differently. More slowly, more mindfully. Not just because of age, but because Leo had taught him how. There's something disarming about being around a creature that doesn't care what you achieve, only that you're present. And presence, as Francis had come to learn, isn't about geography. It's about spirit. It's about being fully here, where your hands are, where your breath is, where your love can land. In the silence of their shared moments, Leo helped Francis see not only the depth of his soul, but the reflection of God's simplicity in it. Not complexity, not doctrine, but closeness. Francis once said to a visitor who asked about Leo, "He doesn't tell me who to be. He just reminds me who I already am." That's the gift animals carry. They hold up a mirror to our spirit, not to shame us, but to bring us back to who we were before the noise, before the expectations, before the weight of the world hardened our hearts. Leo was more than a dog. He was a guide, a mirror, a living grace. And through him, Francis remembered that before being a pope, before being a priest, before being a man of the church, he was simply a soul in search of God. Just like Leo, just like you, just like all of us. The room was dimly lit. No chants, no bells, no cameras. Just a soft breeze drifting through the half-open window of the Pope's private quarters, and the slow, fading rhythm of a man's final breaths. Francis lay still, his body weaker now, but his spirit strangely alert. His eyes no longer wandered. They focused on one thing, the figure curled near his feet. Leo? He hadn't moved for hours. His head rested gently against the leg of the bed, as if he knew this was the end. Not an end to fear, but an end to honor. Those who were present would later say they had never seen anything quite like it. No barking, no pacing, just presence. The kind of presence that knows when words are no longer needed. The kind of presence that understands death without fearing it. As Francis' breathing slowed, his hand trembled slightly, reaching toward the side of the bed. One of the aides moved to help, but the Pope shook his head softly. He didn't need help. He simply wanted to touch Leo one last time. And when his fingers brushed over the dog's fur, Leo lifted his head, not abruptly, not with surprise, but with gentle awareness. As if to say, "I know." Francis took one more breath. Not deep, not loud, but peaceful. And with it, he whispered a final blessing, not to the church, not to the cardinals, not to the world, but to the creature who had loved him without ever asking for anything in return. Doti Benedica, Leo. God bless you, Leo. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't planned. It came from a place deeper than liturgy. It came from love. Because in Leo, Francis had seen a glimpse of Eden. a love without conditions, a bond without ego, a silence that held more presence than any applause ever could. And in blessing Leo, Francis was also blessing something larger. He was blessing every soul that has ever loved quietly, every heart that has stayed when it wasn't noticed, every creature that gives without needing to be understood. It was perhaps his most sincere blessing of all. After his passing, Leo remained beside the bed for hours. No one dared move him. Even the guards, bound by protocol, stood back, silent, watching. There was something sacred in the stillness. When the Vatican staff finally lifted Leo into their arms, they did it gently, as if carrying a relic. He was taken not to a shelter, not to the street, but to a quiet home within the Vatican grounds. One of the Pope's closest friends had already promised to keep him, to let him live the rest of his days in peace. But even there, Leo changed. He ate less. He slept more. He no longer waited at the gate or barked at the gardeners. It was as if a part of his soul had crossed over with a man he had loved. But something stayed behind, and those who visited Leo in those final weeks said they could still feel it. A weight, a warmth, presence. And maybe that's what love does. Maybe it doesn't leave when the body goes. Maybe it lingers in fur and floorboards and morning light. Maybe it breathes into silence, blessing everything it once touched. In the end, it wasn't the papal documents that people remembered most. It wasn't the public speeches or historic visits. It was the way a man loved his dog, and the way his dog loved him back. Quietly, faithfully, completely. And maybe that's the final lesson. That before we are popes or priests, leaders or laity, we are simply souls, longing to love and be loved. And sometimes, the purest blessing is shared, not in the grandeur of a cathedral, but in the silence between a hand and a paw. We often look for God in the clouds, in thunder, in visions, in the voices of prophets. We seek him in miracles and cathedrals, in doctrine and ceremony. But perhaps we've forgotten where he hides best, in the quiet, in the overlooked, in the fur of a creature who simply stays. This story of a pope and his dog may seem too small to carry weight. And yet, isn't that the way God has always spoken? Not through force, but through presence. Not through grandeur, but through grace. Pope Francis didn't use his last breath to speak about politics, theology, or legacy. He used it to care, to love, to protect a soul who had never spoken a word, but who had said everything through loyalty. And in doing so, he reminded us, not with teaching, but with example, that nothing is ever too small to be holy. The final wish of a man who led the world's largest faith community was not for power, preservation, or remembrance. It was for a friend, a companion, a dog named Leo. That alone should stop us. It should cause us to look inward, to ask ourselves, who do I overlook? Who do I rush past? Where have I failed to recognize the sacred in the simple? Because Leo was never just a dog. He was a reflection of what lives inside you and me. The part that longs to be seen without needing to perform. The part that stays when words fail. The part that knows that love, real love, doesn't seek attention. It just shows up again and again. Francis knew that, and through Leo he experienced it. So now we ask, what if we started seeing the world through Leo's eyes? What if we walked into each day not to dominate, argue, or convince, but simply to be present? To love those in front of us without judgment? To sit beside the broken, the weary, the forgotten, even when we don't know what to say? Because maybe the most spiritual thing we can do is not leave anyone alone. Not the lonely, not the suffering, not the quiet souls who, like Leo, have no voice to ask for help, but who carry oceans of loyalty in their silence. This isn't just a story about a pope. It's a call to love deeper, to notice the unnoticed, to bless what the world considers ordinary, to live as if our final wish would reflect our truest values. Because it will. And when your time comes, when the lights grow dim and the room grows still, what will your final wish reveal about you? Will it be a monument to self or a monument to love? Pope Francis answered that question, not with a sermon, but with a sentence. Please don't leave him alone. And now maybe it's our turn to care, to stay, to love with that same radical simplicity, not because the world notices, but because God always does. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone you've loved or someone you've lost, I invite you to write in the comments, "I choose presence over everything." Let it be your vow. Let it be your reminder. Let it be your Leo. And if you know someone who needs this message, someone who feels alone, forgotten, or distant from the sacred, share this video with them. Because sometimes, all it takes is one story to remind someone they are seen, they are loved, and they are never truly alone. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart. Now go on, not to change the world, but to be present in it. And in doing so, you just might find God curled at your feet.